Close your eyes and listen. This is the sound of a world that nearly ended. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. 13 days when humanity stood at the precipice of nuclear war, a heartbeat away from annihilation. But what if those 13 days never happened? What if that nightmare had been diffused a year earlier, not by the complex diplomacy that defined the actual crisis, but by a sudden, decisive military victory? We will not just analyze the Bay of Pigs failure, we will rewrite it. And by the end of this deep dive, you will see how Kennedy's single successful decision in 1961 avoided the immediate crisis of nuclear war, but created a new, decades-long American disaster in its own backyard. If you're enjoying what we're creating, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It helps us out more than you can possibly imagine. To get to our point of divergence, we must travel back to the cold spring of April 1961. A young, inexperienced President Kennedy inherited a covert CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro, a communist ticking time bomb just 90 miles from Florida. Following the 1959 revolution, Castro's seizure of U.S. economic assets and explicit diplomatic alignment with the Soviet Union transformed Cuba from a regional concern into a strategic front in the Cold War. President Eisenhower, viewing Castro as an existential threat to all of Latin America, initiated the plan, codenamed Operation Pluto, to train and equip Cuban exiles to overthrow the regime. The actual failure of the Bay of Pigs fundamentally reshaped the Cold War. It humiliated the United States, emboldened the Soviet Union, and paved the way for nuclear missiles in the Caribbean. The plan, formulated by the CIA, rested on two crucial flawed assumptions: that the landing would spark a massive popular uprising, and that the brigade could quickly secure the mountainous Escambray refuge if things went wrong. It was a recipe for catastrophe. The initial design envisioned a landing near Trinidad, a location offering quick access to those life-saving Escambray Mountains. However, under pressure to reduce visibility and increase deniability, the plan was changed to the remote, swampy, and isolated Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón. This isolated location eliminated any chance for the brigade to perform effective long-term guerrilla warfare if the initial assault failed. The single most devastating operational error was not logistical, but political. Fearing that overt U.S. involvement would provoke the Soviet Union, perhaps challenging the U.S. position in Berlin, Kennedy opted for a perilous half-measure. Kennedy approved the invasion but crippled it by refusing to provide adequate air cover. The lack of consistent air support allowed Castro's remaining air force, including his T-33 jets, to quickly establish air superiority. This air power was then used to destroy the brigade's vital supply ships, crippling their ability to resupply or reinforce the 1,400 men on the beach. The CIA's operational analysis was fundamentally flawed by an overestimation of anti-Castro sentiment and an underestimation of Castro's own fighting prowess and popular legitimacy. The U.S. approach, relying on exile forces, unwittingly tried to revive its imperialist past, an objective that had zero appeal to the Cuban majority. The belief that blood will flow in the streets, in massive counter-revolutionary violence, proved entirely false. The result: the exiles were surrounded within 2 days and defeated by Cuban armed forces under Castro's direct command. This humiliating incompetence was noted internationally. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev could hardly believe his good fortune at the botch. This perceived weakness was what drove the Soviets to solidify military defense agreements, providing the explicit security mandate to introduce offensive weapons, the very weapons that triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis 1 year later. We arrive at the hinge point, the moment of divergence. What if Kennedy had chosen absolute commitment? What if, instead of paralyzing the mission with political caution, he had unleashed the full force necessary to ensure Brigade 2506's success within the crucial 72-hour window? The point of divergence, POD, occurs hours before the landing on April 17, 1961. Kennedy authorizes full, sustained air cover provided by unmarked B-26 bombers and U.S. naval support aircraft flying sorties from the USS Essex. This unwavering commitment is the difference between failure and success. With Castro's small, vulnerable air force neutralized immediately, the brigade secures the beachhead without being cut off from their supplies or reinforcements. The landing force penetrates deeper inland, targeting key governmental and communication hubs. The operational tempo ensures the defeat of Castro's initial counteroffensive forces before they can fully mobilize. The swift military success validates the entire premise. The Democratic Revolutionary Front, DRF, the political wing of the exiles, quickly lands and establishes a provisional government in a major captured city. They immediately broadcast an appeal for international recognition and, crucially, for internal support. This rapid political action fractures Castro's chain of command, leading to documented defections among key Cuban officers and undercutting his ability to rally forces. The outcome shifts dramatically. Castro is forced to flee or is captured within days. The most immediate and profound consequence is the removal of the strategic rationale for the deployment of Soviet missiles. The presence of a friendly pro-American government in Havana means the Cuban regime no longer requires Soviet military protection. The nuclear moment of October 1962 never materializes. However, this success brings forth an unforeseen strategic cost. Historically, the near apocalypse of the CMC forced the US and USSR into a moment of sober recognition regarding the risks of nuclear escalation, leading to the establishment of direct communication channels and cautious détente. By avoiding this, Kennedy skips this critical learning curve. He avoids the political humiliation, achieving an early, decisive victory that prematurely validates his strategy of flexible response through covert military means. This successful gamble could potentially breed overconfidence and a greater appetite for aggressive military solutions in future foreign policy challenges, such as Vietnam or Laos. In reality, Khrushchev saw Kennedy's humiliation at the Bay of Pigs as confirmation of the young president's weakness, giving the Soviet premier the confidence to press aggressively on the simmering Berlin crisis of 1961. The success scenario flips this script entirely. A victorious Kennedy, riding high on a decisive geopolitical win, demonstrates strength and resolve. Khrushchev is now in a defensive posture, having just lost a major communist client state. While the East German brain drain crisis would likely still necessitate the building of the Berlin Wall to stem the flow of people, the United States approaches the ensuing confrontation with significantly higher political capital and greater psychological leverage. This strong position lessens the Soviet inclination to test Kennedy aggressively regarding Western access to Berlin, thereby reducing the immediate diplomatic tensions surrounding the crisis. With the immediate threat of communism 90 miles away neutralized, the U.S. prestige in the Western Hemisphere soars. Revolutionary movements across the continent are severely demoralized by the swift, violent fall of the region's primary communist icon. The Alliance for Progress, AFP, launched by Kennedy in 1961, shifts its primary focus from being a desperate counterinsurgency measure to a purely economic development tool, a Marshall Plan for Latin America. This massive commitment of U.S. funds continues. However, the validation of using covert, swift military intervention establishes a dangerous precedent. U.S. policymakers, having successfully leveraged exiles and special operations to achieve regime change, might increasingly rely on military solutions over political and economic ones in future regional disputes. This successful outcome risks fostering a long-term U.S. arrogance regarding regional stability, leading to an increased frequency of U.S. intervention and preemptive coups against populist or leftist governments throughout the 1960s and 70s. While conventional victory is achieved, the fundamental nature of Castro's revolution, rooted in broad popular support against the previous U.S.-aligned dictatorship, means that the conflict does not simply end. Castro loyalists, the fidelistas, defeated in open battle, retreat to the countryside and mountains. The U.S.-backed Democratic Revolutionary Front, DRF government that takes power, is an administration of exiles, potentially viewed by many Cubans as collaborators of the old, discredited order. The new regime struggles to command genuine internal loyalty. Cuba transforms from a short-term Soviet problem into a long-term, draining American liability. a protracted guerrilla insurgency against determined Fidelista forces. The U.S. is forced to commit significant resources, military aid, and potentially advisors for decades to combat this counterinsurgency, coin warfare, consuming precious resources and political attention throughout the 1960s. This Second Vietnam in the Caribbean requires continuous U.S. military deployment, diverting scarce strategic focus away from other global hotspots, including Southeast Asia. The political cost of being perpetually involved in a bloody, low-intensity conflict 90 miles from home becomes the unintended, decades-long strategic consequence of the swift 1961 victory. In this rewritten history, the Bay of Pigs becomes Kennedy's triumphant confirmation of U.S. resolve. The world avoids the 13 days of nuclear terror, and the Soviet Union suffers a humiliating setback. But success is merely a trade-off. By preventing the Cuban Missile Crisis, the superpowers miss a vital lesson in restraint. Kennedy's military validation encourages future interventionism, destabilizing Latin America. And Cuba becomes an enduring military commitment, a costly, localized war that drags the U.S. deeper into conflict in its own backyard. The failure of 1961 birthed nuclear caution. The success of 1961 would have begotten military overconfidence. Was avoiding the Cuban Missile Crisis worth the cost of a decade-long counterinsurgency in Cuba? Tell us your opinion in the comments below.